It was early autumn of 2012 when I decided to stay for a few days at my uncle's old farm in northern Arkansas. He had passed away the year before, and the property was mostly abandoned except for a few local workers who came around once a month to check on the animals and cut the grass around the main path. I wasn't close to him, but I wanted some time alone, away from the noise of the city and the people around me. The farm had always interested me. Isolated, quiet, and surrounded by miles of overgrown fields, it was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. I arrived late in the afternoon, around 5 p.m. The drive from Little Rock had taken nearly 6 hours, and by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the property, my phone had already lost all service. The road itself was narrow and uneven, with deep tire ruts and patches of mud from a storm that must have passed through a few days earlier. The fields on both sides were full of dying corn stalks, most of them brown and dry. The wind made a constant rustling sound, which was the only noise for miles. The main house was old but solid. It had a wraparound porch, peeling white paint, and windows that looked permanently fogged from years of dust. To the left of it was a small cabin my uncle had built sometime in the late 80s. He used it for hunting trips, and later as a place to sleep when he didn't feel like staying in the main farmhouse. It sat near the edge of a small wooded area, separated from the house by about 50 yards of knee-high weeds and an old rusted fence. I decided that's where I'd stay for the night. The cabin was small, just one room and a short hallway that led to a bathroom. The air inside smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. There was a single cot in the corner with a thin mattress, a small desk by the window, and a wood stove that had long since gone unused. The last person who'd been there must have left it untouched for years. A few tools were hanging on the wall, along with a broken lantern and some old hunting gear. By the time I unpacked and swept some of the dust out, the sun was already low. The fields around the cabin glowed orange, and the air was cooling quickly. I didn't have any electricity or running water, so I used a flashlight and a jug of water I'd brought with me. For dinner, I ate a few cans of beans cold from the tin. There was something strangely peaceful about it at first. No sound of cars, no buzzing of phone notifications, just the quiet creaks of the cabin settling and the distant sound of wind through the dry corn. But as the night came on, that peace began to shift into something else. The silence wasn't calm anymore. It was heavy. Every sound became louder. The ticking of the flashlight as it cooled, the shifting of the wooden walls, even the small pops in the stove's metal. Around midnight, I started hearing noises from outside. Not constant, just every few minutes. A crunch of footsteps in the dry grass, too deliberate to be the wind. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sounds didn't wander off. They came closer, then stopped, then started again, always in a slow, steady rhythm. I sat on the cot, holding the flashlight and listening. The window beside me looked out toward the field, but all I could see was darkness and the faint outlines of the cornstalks moving with the wind. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, waiting for the noise to fade. Didn't. At some point, I heard what sounded like the light tap of metal against wood, maybe against the side of the cabin. Just one sound, but sharp, that broke me out of my stillness. I got up quietly and went to the desk, where I had left a small knife I used for camping. I wasn't planning on using it, but it made me feel better to hold it. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my neck. I stood there, barely breathing, staring at the window. The sound didn't come again, and after what must have been 20 minutes, everything went completely quiet again. So quiet it almost hurt my ears. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up just as the sky started turning gray. My back ached from the cot, and I was still holding the knife in my hand. The first thing I did was step outside. The air was cold and wet, and mist hung low over the fields. The ground was covered in dew, but in the patch of grass just in front of the cabin door, I saw something strange. Several clear boot prints, deep enough that they couldn't have been there from before. They circled the cabin, some stopping near the window, others near the back wall. Whoever it was, they had walked around the place sometime during the night. I followed the prints for a while until they disappeared into the dirt path leading toward the fields. I didn't see anyone, but it left me uneasy all day. I thought maybe it was one of the local workers checking on something, but the tracks were fresh, and the farm had been abandoned for months. I stayed in the cabin anyway, cleaning it out and trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked toward the fields, I thought I saw something move between the rows, just small flashes of motion, like someone ducking down or shifting quickly out of sight. That night, I tried to make myself sleep early. I locked the door, pushed the desk against it, and left the flashlight on beside the cot. I didn't want to sit in darkness again. For a while, everything was still, just the soft hum of insects and the occasional creak of the cabin. But around 2 a.m., I heard something again, the same steady crunching sound as before. It started at the edge of the field and moved slowly closer. This time it didn't stop. It came right up to the side of the cabin, and then I heard the faint scrape of something against the window glass. I froze completely. The flashlight was still on, but I didn't move to pick it up. My breathing felt too loud, like whoever or whatever was outside could hear it. The scraping sound went on for a few seconds, then stopped. I waited, barely blinking, until I heard the slow creak of the wooden steps outside the door. They groaned under the weight of someone standing there. Then silence again. I didn't move for hours. When the morning came, I pushed the desk aside and opened the door carefully. Nothing was there. The mist had rolled in again, thicker than before. But on the porch, the dirt showed a clear set of muddy prints. The toes pointed directly toward the door, and they were fresh. I felt sick just looking at them. That was enough for me. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag in under 10 minutes and loaded everything into the truck. As I was backing up to leave, I noticed something near the edge of the field. It was a small wooden crate, half buried in the dirt like it had been there for a long time. I don't know why, but I stopped and got out to look. The crate was old, nailed shut, and covered in mud. The name Harlan was burned into the wood, my uncle's name. I pried it open with a stick, expecting maybe old tools or something worthless. But inside there were folded papers and a few small objects wrapped in cloth. When I unwrapped one of them, it was a broken wristwatch. The glass was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 11:47. The papers were even stranger: receipts, handwritten notes, and a map of the property with small X marks scattered around different spots in the field. At the bottom of one page, there was a note written in my uncle's messy handwriting: "Don't go out at night. They come when the lights are on." It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't anything supernatural. I think my uncle had discovered something, or someone living out there, maybe people hiding on the land or squatters using the farm to store things. Whatever it was, he must have tried to keep it quiet. I didn't stay to find out more. I threw the box back where I found it, got into my truck, and drove until I saw pavement again. I didn't stop once. Later that week, I looked up the property records online. The land had been marked as condemned years earlier because of old pesticide runoff, but that wasn't mentioned anywhere in my uncle's will. I never went back, but I still think about that night. The prints around the cabin, the scraping sound at the window, and that final note in his handwriting. It wasn't a warning from something otherworldly. It was from someone who had seen something real and terrifying enough to never talk about again. And I think whatever he meant by they're still out there. It had been nearly 5 years since the divorce when I drove past his old cabin for the first time again. The road had changed a little since then. New gravel laid down, fewer trees along the shoulder, but that sharp turn right before the clearing still made my stomach twist the same way it used to. The air around there always felt heavier, colder somehow, even in daylight. I hadn't planned on stopping. I only meant to pass through, on my way to visit my cousin 2 towns over. But when I saw the clearing through the bare trees, something made me slow down. It was late October, around 6 in the evening, and the sky was the color of dirty copper, the kind you see before the light fades completely. The road curved, and there it was. The cabin where my ex-husband Mark used to spend weeks hunting or clearing his head. I used to come with him back when things were still okay between us. I hadn't thought about that place in years, not really. But seeing it again, the roof sagging a little, the same cracked window by the front door, the rusted metal chimney still leaning to one side. It all came back so suddenly that I had to pull over. The car idled on the side of the dirt road while I stared at the place. The tall grass had grown wild around it, reaching almost to the porch steps. The fence that used to surround the property had mostly fallen apart. Only a few crooked posts were left sticking out of the ground. It didn't look like anyone had been there in a long time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned off the engine and sat there, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the faint rustle of leaves. It felt strange seeing something that had once been such a big part of my life reduced to this abandoned, quiet shell. Mark had bought that cabin back in 2009, just before we got married. He said it would be our escape, a place to get away from the noise of the city, but it never really was ours. It was his place, filled with his tools, his smell, his rules. I only came when he asked me to, and after a while, I stopped coming altogether. Still, sitting there in the car, I felt this pull, like I needed to see it up close one more time before leaving it behind forever. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I didn't care anymore. Maybe I wanted closure. Whatever it was, I found myself opening the door and stepping out. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and damp. The leaves on the ground were slick, and my shoes made soft, wet sounds as I walked toward the clearing. The grass brushed against my legs, and I could smell the faint, sour scent of rot coming from somewhere nearby. Maybe a dead animal, maybe just the earth itself. When I reached the front steps, I noticed the old welcome mat still lying there, half buried under dirt and leaves. The faded letters that once said "Home Sweet Home" were barely visible now. The front door was closed, but not locked. The wood around the handle was darkened, water damaged. I pushed it lightly, and it opened with a long, dry creak. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood, mixed with that faint metallic scent that comes when something's been left to decay. The light coming through the windows was weak, but I could still see most of the room. Nothing much had changed. The same small kitchen area with the dented stove, the same wooden table with one leg slightly shorter than the others, the same sagging couch covered in a thin film of dust. The walls still had the deer heads and fishing gear he used to hang up, though a few had fallen and lay on the floor. The rug was curled at the edges, stiff with dirt. I took a few slow steps inside. My own reflection flashed faintly in the dark glass of the window, and for a second, it startled me. I'd forgotten how dim it could get in there even in daylight. My heartbeat picked up a little, but I told myself it was just nerves. I walked toward the small hallway that led to the back room. That room had always bothered me. It was the one Mark kept locked sometimes, saying it was where he stored tools and supplies. I never understood why it needed to be locked, but he was private like that, secretive about things that didn't seem to need secrecy. The door was half open now. I pushed it the rest of the way, and the smell hit me: mold, dampness, and something faintly chemical. The room was almost empty except for a metal chair lying on its side and some old boxes stacked in a corner. I crouched down near one of them and brushed away the dust on the lid. Inside were old hunting magazines, a pair of work gloves, and a rolled-up tarp. Nothing strange, But then I noticed another box beneath it, smaller, sealed shut with duct tape that had yellowed and curled. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to see whatever was inside, but curiosity took over, and I pulled at the tape until it ripped. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Most were normal at first, pictures of the woods, of Mark standing with his rifle, of the cabin itself. But as I flipped through, my stomach began to tighten. Some were of people I didn't know. Women, mostly, sitting in that same kitchen, sometimes outside on the porch, sometimes standing by the woods. None of them looked like they were posing. Their expressions were blank, their postures stiff, like they didn't know the photos were being taken. I sat there for a while, my hands shaking a little, trying to understand what I was looking at. I had never seen any of these before. I didn't know any of those women. There must have been at least 20 different faces, all taken around the same cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just something harmless, maybe people he rented the place to after we split. But the more I looked, the more it didn't make sense. Some of the photos were years apart. The trees looked older, the furniture changed slightly, but the faces kept appearing again, sometimes the same woman in different seasons, sometimes looking thinner, more tired. It didn't feel right. I picked up one of the photos near the bottom of the pile, and my breath caught. It was of me, taken from behind, while I was chopping wood near the fire pit. I remembered that day. It was late afternoon. Mark had gone into town, or at least he said he had. I had no idea anyone had been watching me then. That was when I heard it. Not a voice, not anything dramatic. Just the sound of wood shifting somewhere behind me. A small, heavy thump, like something falling off a shelf. I froze, staring at the open door of the hallway. The house was still and quiet again, but I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise, and backed toward the front of the cabin. The air felt thicker, heavier. I didn't want to look behind me, but I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder once before stepping outside. Nothing moved, but I felt that same pressure, the same sense of being watched, just like when I'd first parked the car. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk calmly back to the car, every step deliberate. Though my hands were trembling so badly, I dropped my keys twice before I got the door open. Once inside, I locked it and started the engine. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Couldn't. Later that night, at a small motel 2 towns away, I laid all the photos out on the bed. I counted 47 in total. The last few at the bottom were recent, taken just last year by the looks of the date printed in the corner. One of them showed the same cabin from the road, and parked near it was a car I didn't recognize. But beside it stood a man who wasn't Mark. He was taller, thinner, wearing the same flannel jacket Mark used to wear. That's when it hit me. Someone else had been using that cabin. Someone still was. Maybe Mark had sold it before he died, or maybe he hadn't. But someone had kept it just the way he left it, and whoever that was, they'd been taking photos just like he used to. The next morning, I packed everything, left the photos in an envelope at the local sheriff's office, and drove straight home. I didn't tell them who I was, didn't give them my name. I just left it there and walked out. That was 6 months ago. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night and the trees start to close in on both sides of the road, I catch myself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see that cabin again, hidden somewhere between the shadows. I've blocked the road from my GPS, avoided that whole area entirely. But 2 weeks ago, a plain brown envelope showed up at my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was my car parked in my driveway. The photo had been taken from across the street at night, and in the reflection of the driver's window, I could see a man's shape, wearing that same old flannel jacket. I first arrived at the old ranger cabin deep in the Bridger Teton wilderness just as the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks. It was the fall of 1997, and I had just turned 27. The drive-in had taken hours along rough, winding dirt roads, the forest pressing close on either side, like it was waiting for me. I had been assigned to a seasonal post for the State Park Service, covering a remote section of the park that saw very few visitors. Most of the time, it was just me, the forest, and the wildlife. The cabin itself was small, weathered from decades of snow and rain. Its wooden walls had turned a deep gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A stack of split firewood leaned against one side, partially rotted from exposure. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. I stepped inside, boots squeaking on the worn wooden floorboards. The interior was simple. A small stove, a cot in the corner, a rickety table, and a few shelves holding jars of preserved food. There was a lantern and a stack of logs near the stove. The windows were covered in a thin layer of grime, making the outside world look like a blurry painting. I spent the first hour unpacking my gear, making sure everything was in order. My job was routine: patrol the surrounding trails, check wildlife activity, and maintain the cabin. But the solitude of the place had a strange weight. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees in a way that sometimes sounded almost human, like whispers brushing against the bark. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the forest settling at night, but the feeling didn't leave me. Night fell quickly. I built a fire in the stove, the orange glow illuminating the cabin's small interior. The shadows on the walls shifted with the flickering flames. The forest beyond seemed to press closer in the dark, dense and silent except for the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of an unseen animal. I sat at the table, staring at the fire, feeling the isolation seep into my bones. This wasn't a cabin for comfort, it was a shelter for survival. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that made my heart pick up, a faint scraping outside, like something dragging across the ground. I froze, listening. The wind had stopped, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. The scraping came again, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Whatever it was close, but it didn't leave any obvious traces. I decided to check outside, thinking maybe a deer or a bear had stumbled near the cabin. I grabbed my jacket, boots still damp from the earlier walk, and stepped into the cold night. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I swept the flashlight around, following the sound, but the noises had stopped. My stomach twisted. The scraping didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something being moved by hands. I circled the cabin once and found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Only the oppressive darkness and the dense smell of wet earth. I went back inside, heart still racing, and locked the cabin door, double-checking the windows. I sat near the stove, trying to calm down. But then came another sound. A soft tapping at the back door, slow and methodical. I didn't move. I wanted to convince myself it was a branch or maybe an animal, but the rhythm was too steady, too purposeful. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon, straining to see through the dark window. The shadows outside shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure duck behind the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Hours passed like that. Every rustle, every branch snapping, set my nerves on edge. I stayed awake, checking the windows every few minutes, listening to the forest. By early morning, the noises had stopped. The first light revealed no footprints, no disturbance, no indication that anyone or anything had been near the cabin. Only the forest, silent and indifferent. I tried to focus on the tasks of the day, patrolling the nearby trails, checking wildlife signs, marking areas of erosion, and noting the movements of elk and deer. During the day, the forest seemed friendly, alive, even beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the golden leaves. But at night, the sense of being watched returned. The first night had been the worst. Over the next few days, I began to notice patterns. Things would be moved inside the cabin. A jar shifted slightly, the fire would stack uneven. Small scratches on the wooden floor where nothing should have been moving. I never saw anyone, and I never heard voices, but the feeling of another presence was undeniable. On the fourth night, the sound was closer. I had been asleep on the cot when a scraping sound woke me. I held my breath, listening as it moved along the outer wall, slow and heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly approached the door. Then, through the small crack beneath the cabin, I saw a shadow slide past. It wasn't human exactly, but it was moving like someone or something was deliberately staying low. I took a deep breath and remembered the rifle I kept in the corner. It was an old bolt-action standard issue for park rangers in remote areas. I gripped it tightly and waited, heart hammering, until dawn began to lighten the sky. By morning, nothing was there again. By the sixth night, I decided I had to confront it. I knew there was no one else around for miles. No hikers, no poachers. It had to be an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but nothing I knew moved like this. I set a small trap outside, baiting it with a piece of meat from the cabin. I stayed inside, watching through the window. Around midnight, I saw it. A large, dark shape creeping near the trap, careful and intelligent. It wasn't a bear or a lion. Its movements were too calculated. It sniffed the bait, then vanished into the darkness. I spent the next morning preparing. I made sure the cabin doors were reinforced, the windows blocked with extra logs, and kept my rifle close at hand. That night, when the sound came again, I was ready. I didn't see it directly, but I aimed toward the noise and fired a warning shot. The echo rolled through the trees, and for the first time, the scraping and tapping stopped immediately. There was a long, tense silence. I stayed awake until the first light, rifle in hand, waiting. The next few nights passed without incident. Whatever had been stalking the cabin had retreated, or perhaps it had learned that the cabin was defended. I never discovered exactly what it was. In the end, the relief of surviving that week, of keeping the cabin intact, gave me a strange sense of accomplishment. I had faced the unknown in one of the most isolated places in the country and come out unharmed. When my shift ended, I left the cabin carefully locked, with extra supplies inside, and hiked back down to the ranger station. I never told anyone exactly what I had experienced. It would have sounded unbelievable, but the cabin, the forest, and the shadows of those nights stayed with me for years. I never returned to that section of the park, but every now and then, I drive past the entrance, looking up at the trees, and I remember the scraping, the tapping, and the cold, intelligent eyes I felt watching me in the dark. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was the wilderness, wild and unpredictable, and I had come face to face with it in its purest, most silent form. I had survived, and that, I realized, was enough. It was early November of 1998 when I drove out to northern Montana, chasing a sense of silence I hadn't felt in years. I was 32, working construction back then, and the noise of the city, trucks, sirens, people shouting, had started to wear me down. I took a week off, packed up my old Chevy with some gear, and drove north without a clear plan. I just wanted to be away from everything. I'd seen a small mark on a paper map weeks earlier, a narrow dirt road leading deep into the woods near Flathead National Forest. Seemed as good a place as any. The drive was rough. The further I went, the less the road made sense. Gravel gave way to patches of dirt and stone, and the trees grew closer until the branches reached across the hood like fingers. Around dusk, I found the cabin. It was old, really old. The roof sagged, and one of the shutters hung half off its hinge. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of anyone being there for years. The place looked like it had been forgotten before I was even born. I parked a few yards away and stepped out. The air was cold and still, thick with that heavy forest smell. Wet pine, mud, and something faintly metallic, like rust. My boots sank into damp leaves. The door to the cabin was swollen from years of rain and sun, but it opened with a slow groan when I pushed. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust and rot. The floor creaked under me. The first room had a collapsed table, a few rusted pots, and the remains of a chair that must have fallen apart decades ago. There were rat droppings on the windowsill and spider webs hanging in the corners like curtains. Still, it was dry, and it felt like a place I could sleep for the night. I had a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a few cans of food, and enough water. I figured I'd make it work. There was an odd calm at first. I set up near the fireplace, even though the chimney looked clogged with debris. I didn't risk lighting a fire. Instead, I sat and ate cold beans from a can while the woods outside settled into darkness. Every sound carried through the forest, the shifting branches, the occasional crack of wood. I tried not to think about being alone out there, but it's hard not to. There's a point deep in the night when the forest doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels alive, like it's watching. I woke up once, maybe around midnight, to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just the sound of something dragging through the leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer. I stayed still, breathing slow, waiting for it to pass. The noise went on for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer, like it was circling the cabin. There was no wind, no rain, nothing to make that sound naturally. I held my flashlight, hand shaking, and pointed it toward the nearest window. The glass was fogged with grime. I couldn't see anything through it. Eventually, it stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, my back against the wall, eyes fixed on that window. When light finally came, I stepped outside, still tense. There were prints in the dirt. Not boots, not bare feet. They were wide, irregular, like something heavy had been dragged. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the leaves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, even though the shape didn't make sense. That day, I decided I'd stay just one more night before heading back. I wanted to see if the trail behind the cabin led anywhere. I took my small backpack, left some food behind, and started walking uphill. The forest grew denser as I went, the path almost invisible under the carpet of needles and leaves. After about an hour, I found what looked like an old hunting blind, half collapsed with rusted nails sticking out of the boards. Near it, there was a pile of wood and something else underneath, covered with dirt. Curiosity got the better of me. I used a stick to brush away some of the soil. Underneath was a metal box, maybe a foot long, with a latch half rusted shut. I pried it open with my knife. Inside, there were small items: an old lighter, a torn map, a faded photo of two men standing by a truck, and a small leather notebook. The pages were damp, the writing nearly gone. What little I could read looked like simple notes. Dates, weather, maybe a list of supplies. The last page had one legible line written in shaky letters: "Don't stay here after dark." That hit me harder than I expected. I don't scare easily, but reading that while standing in silence miles from anyone made me feel small. I packed the notebook and photo in my bag and walked back faster than I came. By late afternoon, the sky had gone gray. The air felt heavier. It wasn't raining, but it smelled like it would soon. I tried to distract myself by fixing a few things around the cabin, pushing a chair leg back into place, clearing the dust near the fireplace, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, that maybe someone just didn't like the forest at night. but deep down I knew it was a warning. When night came again, I couldn't relax. Every little sound set me on edge. The cabin groaned with each gust of wind, and something about it felt different, like the whole place was holding its breath. Around midnight again, the same dragging sound came back. Slow, steady, moving around the cabin in a circle. This time it was closer, right outside the wall. My flashlight beam caught the dust swirling in the air, but nothing else. The sound stopped for a moment, then came again, louder. I could hear it brushing against the wooden wall. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would echo through the floor. Then there was a dull thud, something bumping against the door. Once, twice, then silence. I stayed like that until morning, barely blinking. When light seeped through the cracks again, I finally opened the door. There was something lying in the dirt a few feet away. At first, I thought it was a log, but when I got closer, I saw it was a tarp, old and stiff, wrapped around something long and narrow. The edges were stained dark brown. I crouched and pulled a corner open, and the smell hit me first. Rot, deep and sour. Inside was a human bone, maybe a leg, still tangled with pieces of fabric. I dropped the tarp and stumbled back, shaking. I didn't stay another second. I packed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and got out of there as fast as the dirt road would let me. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then, I had to pull over to breathe. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that place. I called the county sheriff a few days later, told them I'd found what looked like human remains near an abandoned cabin off a service road north of Flathead. They asked for directions, thanked me, and said they'd send someone out. A month later, a deputy called back. They confirmed they'd found what I described. Old bones, maybe decades old, wrapped and buried shallow. They said the cabin had once belonged to two brothers who hunted up there in the 1950s. One had gone missing. The other left town soon after and was never seen again. They didn't find much else. The remains couldn't be fully identified. They said it looked like the body had been moved more than once, maybe by animals or floods. I never went back. Even now, when I drive through quiet roads or pass through forests, I think about that night. The sound of dragging outside the walls, the shape in the dirt, the words in that notebook. It wasn't ghosts or curses or anything supernatural. It was just the kind of darkness that comes from people, quiet, buried, and left to rot in the woods until someone like me stumbles across it. And that's the thing that still keeps me up sometimes. Not what I saw, but what I didn't. The years of silence that kept that cabin standing there, holding someone's secret under its floorboards, waiting for the sound of footsteps to come again. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to spend a few quiet days alone in a hunting cabin deep in the mountains of northern Montana. I had been working long weeks at a construction job and needed a break from the constant noise of the city. A friend of mine told me about this old place his uncle used years ago, said it was quiet, remote, and stocked with everything I'd need for a few days of hunting and rest. I didn't ask too many questions. I packed my rifle, a few cans of food, some firewood, and drove up early one Friday morning. By the time I reached the dirt road that led toward the cabin, the sun was starting to set behind the tree line. The forest was thick and silent, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that always comes right before winter. The tires on my truck slipped a little on the loose gravel, and the headlights caught the steam of my breath through the cracked window. It took almost an hour to reach the clearing where the cabin sat, and when I finally turned off the engine, the silence hit me hard. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring a little. No traffic, no wind, just the soft ticking of the engine cooling down. The cabin was small but solid. The wood was dark from years of weather, and there was a single chimney on one side that still looked usable. A few old hunting traps hung from nails near the door, and a rusted axe leaned against the steps. I unlocked the door with the old key my friend had given me and stepped inside. The smell of old pine and dust hit me right away. The air was stale, but not unpleasant. Inside, there was a small table, 2 wooden chairs, a cot in the corner, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used often. I unpacked slowly, stacking my food on the counter, filling a jug from the water barrel outside, and setting up my sleeping bag on the cot. By the time I finished, it was almost dark. I started a small fire in the fireplace, cooked a can of chili over the flame, and sat in the glow for a while, listening to the crackle. It was peaceful at first. I could hear the fire pop, the faint wind outside, and my dog, Rex, breathing softly near the door. He was a big German shepherd, calm but alert, and I trusted his instincts more than anyone's. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, Rex lifted his head and gave a low growl. I froze in my cot, staring at the shadows flickering across the ceiling. The wind had died completely, and the forest outside seemed too quiet. I waited, listening. A minute passed, then another. I could hear something faint, a crunch maybe, footsteps, slow and uneven, moving somewhere behind the cabin. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a coyote. Rex stood up, staring at the back wall, the hair on his neck standing up. I whispered his name, and after a few tense seconds, he sat back down, though he kept his eyes on the wall. Eventually, I drifted off again, but it was a light sleep, the kind where every sound wakes you. The next morning, I found a set of footprints behind the cabin, clear in the soft dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, wide, and uneven, like someone had been limping. I crouched down and followed them a few yards into the trees, but they stopped near a fallen log and disappeared. I didn't like that. It didn't make sense for anyone to be out here barefoot in this cold. I tried to shake it off, told myself maybe someone had camped nearby and wandered through during the night. That day, I went out hunting. The forest was dense and quiet, and after a few hours, I managed to spot a buck moving through a clearing. I lined up my shot and took it clean. By the time I dragged the deer back and hung it outside to clean later, the light was fading. I noticed something strange then. Rex wouldn't stop staring at the tree line, the same spot where the prints had been. His ears were forward, his body stiff. I called him back, and he came, but he kept looking over his shoulder. That night, I built a bigger fire. I didn't like the silence outside. It felt heavy, like something was pressing down on the forest. I sat at the table for a while, sharpening my knife, and every so often I'd hear a sound outside. Light, scraping noises, or a soft shuffle like something brushing against the wall. Rex paced by the door, low growls rumbling in his throat. Around midnight, something hit the window. Just a dull thud, but enough to make me stand up fast. I grabbed my rifle, stepped closer, and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just darkness. The fire inside made my reflection in the glass bright, and everything beyond looked black. I turned off the lantern, stood in the dark, and waited for my eyes to adjust. The forest came into view, pale shapes of trees and faint moonlight between them, and that's when I saw it, just at the edge of the clearing near the tree line. A figure standing still, tall, thin, motionless. It didn't move, not even when Rex started barking and lunging at the door. I stood there, frozen, staring through the glass. The figure turned slowly, like it had noticed me, and stepped back into the trees without a sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle across my lap, waiting for it to come back. It never did. The next morning, I found more tracks. Same bare feet, same uneven steps, circling the cabin this time. They were close, just inches from the walls in some spots. I checked the woods, the trails, everything around, but found nothing. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was hours away and the truck was parked off the old dirt road, which wasn't exactly easy to drive in the dark. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then head back early in the morning. That evening, I cleaned the deer, packed what meat I could, and burned the scraps far from the cabin. I didn't want anything drawing predators close. But when I came back, I noticed the cabin door was open, just slightly, maybe an inch. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. Rex wouldn't even go inside at first. When I did, everything looked the same, except my sleeping bag was pulled halfway off the cot. It wasn't torn or anything, just shifted, like someone had touched it. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to see what was happening outside without the reflection in the window. I sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight again, I heard it. Slow steps on the porch. The wood creaked under weight, then silence. I gripped the rifle and waited. Rex growled, low and deep, staring at the door. Then came a scraping sound, something sliding across the doorframe, slow and steady, like nails dragging on the wood. My throat felt dry, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I waited until the noise stopped, then slowly moved toward the window. The moonlight was brighter that night, and I could see more of the clearing. Something was standing just off the porch, half hidden by the shadow of a pine tree. It wasn't moving. I could see the outline of its arms, long, hanging too low, one bent strangely, like it had been broken. I raised the rifle, aimed through the glass, and fired once. The echo slammed through the trees and died out fast. I reloaded and waited, but the figure was gone. I went outside after a few minutes, my hands shaking. There was blood near the steps, dark and fresh, leading off into the trees. I followed it for maybe 100 feet before I saw a piece of torn fabric on a bush, dark, like an old shirt. I didn't go further. At dawn, I packed everything and loaded the truck. Rex wouldn't stop whining until we were back on the main road. When I finally reached the nearest gas station, I told the owner about what happened. He just nodded and said the land up there used to belong to a man who went missing years ago. They never found him, only his clothes and his tools left behind in the woods. I never went back to that cabin again. But sometimes, when I think about those footprints circling the walls and that sound of nails dragging against the door, I wonder how long he'd been living out there. If he'd been watching cabins like that one for years, waiting for someone to stay the night alone. Whatever I saw, it wasn't a ghost or some creature. It was a man, wild and broken, hiding out there in the woods. And I think about how close he must have been when I slept, just a few feet away, watching through the cracks in the window. It was late autumn, 1998. I was 29 and had taken a few weeks off work to be alone for a while, away from the noise of the city and the constant pull of people. I'd been living in Manchester, renting a small flat near the center, but I'd grown tired of the cramped walls and the sound of traffic every night. I needed space, quiet space, so I drove north into the countryside of Cumbria, where the hills seemed endless and the air had a kind of clean coldness that cut through your chest. I'd been planning to build a small cabin on a piece of land my late uncle had left behind years ago. It wasn't much, just a clearing near a slope of pine trees, a rough trail leading down to a stream, and the remains of an old shed. The roof of the shed had caved in long ago, and moss had claimed most of the wood. But the land was mine now, and I wanted to make something out of it. A place that was quiet, plain, and away from everything. When I got there, the weather was dull. The clouds hung low, the kind that seemed to press down against the hills. The air was damp, heavy with that smell of wet soil and old leaves. I set up my small tent near the edge of the clearing and began unloading tools from my van, an old blue one I'd borrowed from a friend. The ground was soft from earlier rain, and my boots sank slightly into the mud with every step. I started working that same afternoon, sawing and nailing the basic frame together. I'd brought enough wood to make a small single-room structure, something barely big enough for a bed, a chair, and a small stove. It was tiring, but it felt good. The sound of the saw cutting through the wood, the smell of pine and damp bark, it all felt grounding. By the time evening rolled around, the clouds had grown darker. The light faded fast between the trees, and the wind began to pick up. I didn't want to stop, though. I kept working, hammering nails into place, trying to get at least the walls up before the night settled in. The sound of distant thunder rolled through the valley, slow and heavy. I thought it would pass. Didn't. The rain started around 9. At first it came down soft, just a light tapping on the tarp I'd stretched above my tools. But within minutes, it turned into a downpour. Sheets of water hammering against the wood, the ground turning slick beneath my feet. I pulled the tarp tighter, made sure my things were covered, and decided to sit in the half-built cabin to wait it out. There was no roof yet, only the wooden frame with crossbeams overhead, so the rain came right through. I sat on one of the dry planks near the wall, the faint light from my lantern cutting through the misty air. The sound of the rain was deafening, hitting the leaves and the metal of my toolbox, running down the half-nailed boards in thin silver lines. After a while, I started to notice how dark it had become. Out there, beyond the lantern's glow, the forest was just a wall of black. The rain blurred everything, but I could still make out shapes, the uneven tree trunks, the slope of the land. Every now and then lightning flashed, just enough to reveal the landscape for a second. The stream glinting in the distance, the edge of the shed ruins, the tall grass bent under the wind. I tried not to think too much. I just sat there, listening. The rain can do strange things to your sense of space when you're alone. It fills every gap with noise until you start hearing things that aren't really there. I thought I heard footsteps once, faint and quick, splashing near the stream. But I told myself it was probably water running off the slope. Still, I found myself glancing toward that direction again and again. The night dragged on and I couldn't sleep. The tent was soaked, so I stayed inside the cabin frame, wrapped in my jacket, waiting for the storm to ease. It never did. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply. The lantern started to flicker, the flame fighting against the damp air. I checked the time, past midnight. That's when I heard something else. A dull thud, followed by a sharper crack. It sounded close, maybe from the side of the clearing. I thought it might have been a tree branch breaking off, but the sound came again, slower this time, like someone stepping on wet wood. I stayed still, my hands cold and my back tense. There was another flash of lightning, and in that split second I saw something or someone, standing near the old shed ruins. The light was too quick for detail, but I could tell it was a person. Tall, wearing something dark. Then the thunder rolled, and everything went black again. I stayed completely still, trying to hear through the rain. Nothing, just the steady pounding of water. I kept telling myself it was my eyes playing tricks, that maybe I saw one of the collapsed beams or the trunk of a tree. But the sound came again, a faint shuffle through wet grass, slow and deliberate, moving closer. I grabbed the hammer from beside me. My palms were slippery from the rain. I crouched lower and listened. Whoever or whatever it was moving along the side of the half-built cabin. I could hear the squelch of boots in the mud, the sound of something brushing against the wooden wall. It stopped right outside. I didn't breathe. The rain poured harder, masking almost every other sound, but I could feel the presence there. Close enough that I imagined I could hear the weight of each breath if the storm weren't so loud. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Then I heard it move again, slowly circling the cabin. The boards creaked slightly as something leaned against them. I held the hammer tighter, my knuckles white. The lantern flickered again, the light weak and trembling. Another flash of lightning came, and for that brief moment, I saw through the gaps in the wall. A shadow just a few feet away, moving along the outer frame. I caught a glimpse of a face turned slightly, wet hair plastered against it, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. I stayed where I was until the light went out completely. The lantern gave its last flicker, and I was left in total darkness. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually the sound stopped. The rain kept falling, the thunder drifted away, and all I could hear was the endless patter of water hitting wood. By dawn, the storm had finally passed. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that feels almost hollow after a long night of noise. I stepped out carefully, scanning the clearing. Everything was soaked, the tools, the ground, the tent. The stream was swollen and muddy, but what caught my attention were the footprints. They were clear in the soft earth, leading from the edge of the trees toward the shed ruins, then around my cabin and back into the woods. They were deep, wide, and fresh. Someone had definitely been there. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. Whoever it was had been watching me, maybe the whole time I was building. I never finished that cabin. I packed everything by noon, loaded it all into the van, and drove out before the sky turned gray again. I didn't look back once. For months afterward, I thought about that night. The sound of the rain, the steps, the shape I'd seen in the lightning. Maybe it was just a lost hiker or someone living off the land, but the way they moved, the way they stayed silent and close didn't feel right. Felt like they'd been waiting for something, or maybe just watching. Years later, when I finally went back to sell the land, the shed was gone completely. Nothing left but some rotted beams. The ground where I'd started building the cabin was overgrown with grass and weeds, but there were marks in the dirt near the same spot. Fresh ones, like someone had been digging recently. I didn't stay long enough to find out why. I signed the sale papers, left the key with the agent, and drove away for good. Even now, when it rains hard and I hear that same hammering sound against the windows, I sometimes think about that night. The figure by the shed, the footprints circling my half-built cabin, and I can still feel the same cold air on my skin, as if the memory never really dried out. It was the middle of October 2013 when I decided to drive out to my grandma's old cabin in northern Michigan. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a teenager. She passed away when I was 21, and after that, the family mostly ignored the place. It was too far out in the woods, too quiet, and too full of memories that made everyone feel uneasy. But now, 10 years later, I just wanted a few days alone, away from people and noise. My divorce had been finalized that summer, and the city felt like a place where every sound was too sharp. I packed up my truck with some food, water, and my dog, Max, and took the long drive north. The road turned to gravel halfway there. I could see the thin trees on both sides, bare at the top, their leaves dying in orange and brown heaps on the forest floor. The air had that cold, dry feeling that comes before winter. The old dirt trail that led to the cabin was barely visible under a mess of weeds and branches, but I recognized it. My grandma's place sat on a flat patch of land near a creek. The cabin was small. One floor, a front porch, and a rusted metal roof that always whistled when the wind hit right. When I stepped out of the truck, I could smell the wet earth and old wood. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The porch sagged, the windows were cloudy, and the door was covered with layers of chipped paint. I unlocked it with the same key that had been hanging in my drawer for years. The hinges moaned as it opened. The air inside was stale, like dust and old fabric, mixed with something faintly metallic. I started unpacking, setting my bag by the table and laying out Max's blanket in the corner. He sniffed around for a while, tail down, uneasy in the unfamiliar place. I swept the floor with a broken broom and wiped the dust off the small window over the sink. The water didn't work, so I filled a bucket from the creek to rinse my hands. As the sun started dropping, I lit a few candles and sat by the window, listening to the quiet. The forest here had a sound of its own. Low hums, the distant snapping of branches, a faint rustle of leaves that always seemed closer than it should be. I tried to relax, but something about the stillness pressed down on me. I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that the place wasn't exactly empty. That night, the wind picked up. The trees outside creaked and bent. I had locked the front door, but I kept waking up every hour, hearing faint thuds from the porch or scratching sounds near the back of the cabin. Max would lift his head, ears pointed, and stare toward the wall. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and checked outside. Nothing but branches scraping against the window. Still, it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next morning, I decided to clean out the small storage shed behind the cabin. My grandma used to keep old tools in there: shovels, paint cans, rusty nails. The shed door was swollen from rain, and I had to force it open. Inside, everything was coated in a thin layer of dirt and spider webs. I moved a few boxes around and stacked some firewood outside. As I was clearing space, I noticed a section of floorboards near the back that looked newer than the rest. They were nailed down tight, but the color was different, lighter, less worn. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the edges. The nails were rusted, but not as much as the others. It looked like someone had replaced that section not too long before the place was abandoned. I felt an odd twist in my gut. My grandma had lived alone here for years after my grandpa died, and I couldn't imagine her doing repairs herself, especially on a hidden spot like that. I got a crowbar from the porch and pried one of the boards loose. The smell that came out from underneath was thick and rotten. I froze, holding my breath, then pulled back another board. That's when I saw it. A shape wrapped in black garbage bags, the plastic stiff and torn in spots. The smell hit harder, a wave of decay and dirt and something else. Something like old meat left too long in the heat. I backed up, knees weak, staring down at what I already knew wasn't just trash. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to my heart pound. The woods were silent. Not even the birds made a sound. I wanted to close it up and pretend I never saw it, but my hands were shaking too bad to move. I peeled back one of the torn spots. Beneath it was fabric, dark denim, and then under that, a piece of pale skin. I stumbled outside and threw up behind the shed. Max barked from the porch, his tail stiff, the hair along his back standing up. My mind was racing. Who could it be? My grandma hadn't had visitors, at least not that anyone knew of. She rarely left the cabin in her last years, just took walks around the creek and came back before dusk. After a while, I forced myself to go back in. I didn't want to leave it like that. I took a shovel and started clearing the dirt around the edges. The ground underneath was dark and packed tight, like it had been filled in years ago. The plastic had stuck to the soil, tearing as I worked. There was no doubt now it was a body, a human body, curled up and buried under the floorboards. The smell got worse the deeper I went. I found part of a shoe, then a hand. The skin stretched and dry, fingers bent awkwardly. I dropped the shovel and stepped back, breathing through my sleeve. My head felt light. I remember thinking, I shouldn't be here. I went back inside the cabin and sat down on the floor. The light through the window had turned gray, and the air felt colder. My thoughts were scattered, but one thing kept circling. My grandma. She'd lived here alone for almost 15 years after my grandpa passed. I tried to remember if anyone had ever gone missing around that time, but nothing came to mind. When evening came, I packed up my things, locked Max in the truck, and drove down the trail until I got a signal. I called the sheriff's department and told them what I found. They told me to stay nearby, but I couldn't make myself go back to the cabin, so I waited by the main road. The investigation took a few weeks. I got updates from one of the officers who handled the case. The body was a man, middle-aged, dead for at least 15 years. He wasn't anyone from the family, not a relative or a neighbor. They ran his fingerprints and matched them to a man who'd gone missing in 1998, a contractor from a nearby town. It turned out he'd done some work on my grandma's property the same year she had new boards put in the shed. According to the records, he was supposed to come back to finish the job but never did. My grandma told everyone he left without getting paid. No one questioned it back then. The police didn't find any other signs of violence in the cabin, just that one buried body. They said there was blunt force trauma on the skull, but no way to tell who did it after all those years. There wasn't enough evidence left to prove anything. When it was all over, I went back one last time to get the rest of my things. The shed was taped off, the boards gone, the ground turned over. The cabin felt empty in a way it hadn't before. Every sound, every shadow reminded me of what had been under my feet the whole time. I stood on the porch, looking out at the trees and the creek beyond. The wind was colder now, sharper. I thought about my grandma, how quiet she'd been, how she never let anyone visit too long, how she always kept that shed locked. Maybe she was protecting someone, or maybe she just didn't want anyone to find what she'd done. I'll never know. I locked the door and dropped the key under the mat. The cabin stood still behind me, silent and hollow, as I drove away down the narrow dirt road. The sun was setting behind the trees, and for the first time, I understood why no one ever came back here after she died. It wasn't just the loneliness, it was what she'd left buried. It was early November of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the noise of everything. My job had been wearing me down, the kind of stress that eats at you even when you're trying to sleep. I'd rented a small cabin deep in northern Montana, somewhere near the edge of Flathead National Forest. I wanted quiet, just me and my dog, Scout. He was a big shepherd mix, protective but gentle, the kind of dog that sensed moods better than people did. I thought a week alone in the woods would help clear my head, maybe even reset something inside me. The cabin was old, built maybe in the 70s, with dark wood walls that smelled faintly of pine and damp. It sat about 2 miles off a dirt trail that barely counted as a road anymore. When I first pulled up, the late afternoon light was already dimming behind the tree line. The place looked exactly how you'd picture it. Wood stacked near the porch, a small metal chimney, and a single rocking chair with chipped paint. There was no cell signal at all, but that was fine. I told my sister where I'd be and when I'd be back. Inside, the cabin had only the basics: a small wood stove, a narrow cot, an old table, and a single window facing the trees. I brought enough food for both of us, some canned stuff and a cooler of meat. Scout explored every corner like he was inspecting the place for me, his nails clicking softly against the wood floor. The forest outside was silent except for wind and the occasional caw of a crow. That first night was quiet. I made a small fire, read from an old paperback, and listened to the logs crackling in the stove. The sound of the fire mixed with the slow breathing of Scout at my feet made it easy to relax. I fell asleep thinking that this trip was exactly what I needed. The second day was colder. The wind picked up, shaking the thin window panes, and the air smelled like rain. I decided to hike down to a nearby creek that the owner told me about when I picked up the keys. The path was faint, more like a memory of a trail than an actual one, covered in wet leaves and fallen branches. Scout stayed close, occasionally running ahead but always circling back. The forest felt heavier than before, dense and darker even though it was only midday. I found the creek about an hour later. The water was shallow, moving fast over gray stones. There were deer tracks along the edge, and I remember thinking I should come back early one morning and sit quietly to see what might pass through. Scout sniffed around for a while and then froze suddenly, staring across the water toward the trees. His ears were stiff, and the fur along his back raised slightly. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just a thick line of pines and a few dead logs. I brushed it off as a scent he caught, maybe an animal, but his reaction lingered in my head as we walked back. By the time we reached the cabin, clouds had gathered and the sky had that dull gray look that always means rain. I spent the evening splitting some wood and heating canned soup. The quiet that night felt different, less peaceful. The forest had gone completely silent outside, and Scout refused to leave the porch when I opened the door. He stood there, staring into the dark like he was listening for something. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, hard to place at first, like a scraping sound coming from outside the cabin. I stayed still, hoping it was just a branch in the wind, but the sound came again, slow, deliberate. Scout lifted his head and gave a low growl, deep in his throat. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and pointed it toward the window. Nothing, just black trees and the faint outline of the porch. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening. Eventually the sound stopped, and I must have drifted back to sleep sometime near dawn. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw footprints in the mud near the side of the cabin. Not animal tracks, boots. Deep impressions from heavy soles, the kind that leave square-edged marks. They led around the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. My stomach dropped a little when I saw them. It hadn't rained enough overnight for the prints to stay that clear unless whoever made them had been there not long before I woke up. I didn't see any sign of damage. No broken windows, no disturbed woodpile, nothing. I tried to convince myself maybe it was just an old set of prints from before I arrived. But that didn't sit right. The ground had been soft since the rain started. Those marks were fresh. That day I didn't go far. I kept near the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. Scout stayed close too, barely leaving my sight. Around evening, the wind shifted again, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. I built a fire inside and locked the door before dark. Then, just after the fire started to die down, I heard it again. Slow movement outside, like someone stepping carefully through wet leaves. Scout stood and faced the door, stiff and silent this time. The sound circled the cabin, one step at a time, pausing every few seconds. I turned off the flashlight so I wouldn't draw attention through the window. My pulse felt like it was in my throat. It went on for a few minutes, then stopped completely. I didn't move. Scout stayed by the door, staring, waiting. I couldn't tell if whoever it was had gone or was just standing out there. I sat like that for what felt like an hour before exhaustion took over. When morning came, I went outside again. This time the ground showed more prints, circling the cabin. Some came right up near the steps. I could see where whoever it was had stood under the window. They weren't old tracks either. The edges were sharp, and one even had a small puddle forming inside it from dew. I followed them a few yards into the woods before stopping. It felt wrong to go any farther. That's when I saw something else. A small piece of cloth caught on a low branch. It was dark green, torn from a jacket maybe, soaked and frayed at the edge. That confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been out there, watching. I didn't pack up right away. I wanted to believe I could handle it, that maybe it was just a hiker lost in the woods. But the longer I stayed, the more it felt like waiting for something to happen. I couldn't stop checking the window, couldn't stop glancing at the tree line. Scout barely slept that night, pacing between the door and my bed, growling softly whenever a branch cracked outside. By the fifth morning, I decided to leave a day early. I loaded everything into the truck fast, barely eating breakfast. Before starting the engine, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The door looked smaller than I remembered, the whole place seeming swallowed by the trees. As I turned onto the trail leading back to the main road, Scout suddenly barked, short and sharp. I looked in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the edge of the woods, far enough that I couldn't see their face, but close enough that I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. They didn't move, just stood watching as the truck crawled down the dirt road. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove straight until I hit the highway and didn't look back again. Later, when I dropped off the keys at the rental office, I asked the owner if anyone else had a cabin near that spot. He said no, the next one was at least 5 miles away. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the figure in the trees. I just nodded, thanked him, and drove home. That night, back in my apartment, I unpacked Scout's things and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I got up for a glass of water and saw him sitting near the window, staring out at the street below. He wasn't growling or tense, just watching. But for a moment, the sight of him there made the air feel heavy again, like the forest hadn't fully let me go. I never went back to that cabin. And even now, sometimes when I take Scout out late at night, if I hear the slow crunch of footsteps behind us, just one or two before fading away, I feel that same tight pull in my chest I felt up there in the woods. It's not fear of ghosts or anything like that. It's knowing how real people can be when they decide to stay hidden. It was October of 2013 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin deep in the mountains of northern Arizona. I was 31 then, and I'd just gone through a long stretch of working night shifts at a logistics warehouse. My body was tired, my head was full, and I just wanted silence. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old, made from rough-cut logs that had turned dark with age, with a tin roof and a single stone chimney. There was no phone signal up there, and the nearest town was about 20 miles down a narrow dirt road that twisted through pine forest and red earth. I brought my truck, a week's worth of food, a few books, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't there to hunt, but I felt better having it around. I'd heard stories from locals at the gas station about wild animals wandering close to cabins during the colder months. Mountain lions, coyotes, and sometimes black bears. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd camped alone before, and I liked the quiet. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my mornings chopping firewood and my afternoons walking through the woods behind the cabin. The air was dry, and the forest smelled like pine and dust. At night, the wind moved through the trees and made the walls creak a little, but I didn't mind. I slept early, wrapped in a heavy blanket, listening to the faint rustling of branches outside. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. On the third night, something changed. Started around 1 a.m. I woke up suddenly, not because of a sound, but because of the feeling that something wasn't right. The air inside the cabin felt heavier. I sat up in bed, listening. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It was strong enough that night to make the shutters rattle. But then I heard it, a long, drawn-out scraping sound coming from the back of the cabin. It was slow, almost like someone dragging a piece of wood along the outer wall. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch that had fallen and was being pushed by the wind. But then I heard soft footsteps circling the cabin. They weren't the quick, light steps of an animal. They were slow, deliberate, almost careful. I sat perfectly still, listening as they moved from one side of the cabin to the other, stopping once in a while. My heartbeat felt too loud in the quiet. The cabin had one small window beside the bed, and even though I wanted to look, something in me refused to move. I just sat there, gripping the edge of the blanket, trying to steady my breathing. After maybe a minute, the footsteps stopped near the front porch. I could hear the faint creak of the old boards outside, like weight being placed carefully on them. Then it went quiet. I stayed awake until sunrise, too scared to even close my eyes. When the light came through the window, I finally got up, grabbed the rifle, and went outside. The air was cold and still, There were no fresh footprints, but the ground was hard and dry, covered in needles and rocks. What I did notice was a strange smell, something sharp and sour, almost like copper mixed with wet fur. It lingered near the porch steps, then faded as I walked further out. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been a coyote, I told myself. Maybe my mind had played tricks in the dark. I spent the rest of the day splitting wood and staying busy, but every few minutes I caught myself looking toward the tree line. Felt like I wasn't alone. That night, I kept a fire going inside the cabin, letting the orange light flicker off the walls. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus on the words. Around midnight, I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't outside. It sounded like something brushing lightly against the window. I froze. The cabin only had one small curtain, and light from the fire cast my shadow on it. Whatever was outside could easily see me. The scratching grew slower, softer, then stopped. For a moment, I thought it was gone, until I smelled it again, that same coppery, wet scent. It was stronger now, pushing through the thin wood of the walls. My stomach turned. I didn't move. I just watched the curtain. Then something pressed against it from the outside, an outline not quite right. It looked like a hand, but too long. The fingers stretched out thin, almost bending backward. It stayed there for a few seconds, then slid down the fabric slowly. I grabbed the rifle, loaded a round, and aimed toward the door. My hands were shaking, but I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, everything went still again. The fire burned low. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I went out and checked the window. There were smudges on the glass. Not clear fingerprints, but marks like someone had pressed something oily or dirty against it. I didn't see tracks, but I did find something caught in the porch railing. It was a clump of coarse, grayish hair. Too long for a coyote, too rough for a deer. It smelled like the same thing I'd noticed before. I wrapped it in tissue and threw it in the wood stove, watching it curl and smoke. By the fifth night, I was running on almost no sleep. I decided that if anything else happened, I'd leave at first light. I kept the rifle next to the bed, loaded, and I stacked some furniture in front of the door just in case. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise that was nothing like the others before. It was a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a human breath. Came from just outside the window, too close to mistake. I stayed absolutely still, staring at the ceiling. The noise continued for several minutes, circling the cabin again. I could hear the crunch of dry needles, then a scrape against the siding, and once, what sounded like a soft thud against the wall, like something large had leaned into it. Then came the worst part. Something started knocking. Slow, steady knocks on the wood. 3 times. Then silence. I felt my throat close. I couldn't bring myself to move, but I knew I had to do something. I reached for the rifle and sat up, staring at the door. I waited for the sound again, but it never came. Instead, I heard the boards of the porch creak one last time, and then nothing but wind. I must have drifted off sometime near dawn, because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was cutting through the cracks in the wall. I packed up everything I could fit in my truck, leaving most of the firewood and food behind. When I went to untie the chain from the gate at the end of the driveway, I noticed something in the dirt, a single bare footprint. It was long, thin, and deep in the center, almost like the shape of a human foot but slightly twisted, with the toes spread unnaturally wide. The skin pattern looked rough, cracked, almost like bark. I stared at it for a long time. Then I got in the truck and drove until I reached the highway, not stopping once. A few weeks later, back home in Flagstaff, I told a friend about it, just the part about the noises and the marks. He mentioned stories people told in that part of Arizona about old creatures that took the form of humans, animals, or something in between. I didn't pay much attention to that. I didn't believe in stories like that, and I still don't. But I do know what I saw and I know what I smelled. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't any animal I've ever known. I never went back to that cabin. The owner sent me an email months later saying that another tenant had broken the lease early, complaining of hearing footsteps outside at night. He asked if I'd had the same issue. I didn't reply. Even now, when I drive through that part of the state, I keep my windows up. The smell of the dry pine and red dust reminds me of that week, and how silence in the middle of nowhere can sometimes sound like something waiting just beyond the trees. It was late October 2019 when I decided to take a break from work and spend a few days alone in a rented cabin near the edge of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. I was 32 at the time, working as a mechanic in Nashville, and I just needed to get away from the noise, from people, from the constant pressure of the city. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden place tucked between thick trees, about half a mile from a dirt road. It had a small front porch, a single bedroom, a bathroom, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The owner told me it used to belong to her late father, and she only rented it out occasionally to hunters or people like me who wanted peace and quiet. The first day went by peacefully. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. I spent most of that day cutting firewood, cleaning the place up a bit, and walking around the nearby woods. Felt good to be disconnected. My phone barely had a signal, and the silence was thick, so quiet that even the sound of wind brushing through the trees seemed louder than normal. That night, I lit a small fire in the fireplace and read for a while before going to bed. Everything was calm. On the second day, I woke up early and noticed something odd. The ground near the edge of the cabin's property, just before the trees started, had fresh footprints. They weren't mine. I had walked around there the previous day, but these prints were different. They were deeper, longer, and pointed away from the cabin, toward the woods. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hunter passed through, or some hiker had wandered too close. The prints looked human, definitely not animal. Still, it made me slightly uneasy, so I checked if the door was locked. It was. That evening, I cooked some canned soup on the stove and sat by the window while eating. The light outside faded faster than it did in the city. The forest turned dark like someone threw a thick black sheet over it. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Around 9 p.m., I decided to step outside to get some fresh air. The air was cold, and I could smell wet leaves. The forest was dead silent, and that silence had weight to it. I remember standing there, looking out into the trees, feeling the strange sense of being watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks because I wasn't used to so much isolation. I went back inside, shut the door, and went to bed. The third night was when things began to feel wrong. I was woken up around 2 a.m. by a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like dry leaves being stepped on. Then a soft crunch, then another. My bed was by the window that faced the woods, and I lay completely still, staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps weren't heavy, more like someone walking slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise. I didn't move for several minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. When the noise stopped, I slowly turned my head toward the window. The curtains were closed, but I could see a faint shape through them, something moving past the glass. My first instinct was that maybe it was a deer, but the shape was too tall, too upright. I didn't dare move. I lay there for what felt like hours before drifting back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground beneath the window had clear footprints again, bare feet. The prints were clean, detailed enough to see the outline of toes and the curve of the heel. The air that morning was cold enough that my breath came out white, so whoever it was had been walking barefoot in near-freezing temperature. I remember staring at those footprints, feeling my stomach twist. For the rest of that day, I tried to convince myself that maybe some drifter had passed through, or maybe a local. But there were no nearby houses, no signs of anyone living within miles. I stayed near the cabin, chopping wood and keeping busy. I didn't go far into the trees anymore. As the sun began to drop, I made sure every door and window was locked tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of those footprints wouldn't leave my mind. I lay awake, listening to the fire crackle. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was clearer. Slow, dragging footsteps circling the cabin. My throat felt dry. I could hear the faint scrape of something brushing against the wooden wall outside. The sound would stop, then start again on the other side. It was as if someone was walking slowly around the cabin, pausing every few seconds. Then came a soft thud, something tapping the glass. Once, twice, I held my breath. I didn't move. I just stared at the dark ceiling, frozen. I had a small axe I used for splitting firewood resting near the door. I thought about grabbing it, but I couldn't move. I felt like my whole body was locked up. The tapping stopped. Then silence again. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because the next thing I remember was the pale morning light coming through the curtains. I jumped out of bed and went straight to the window. The glass had faint smudges on it, long streaks like fingerprints. There were more footprints too, circling the cabin, overlapping one another, as if someone had been pacing around for hours. By the fourth day, I'd had enough. I started packing my things, ready to leave earlier than planned. The owner's old truck that I had borrowed was parked about 30 yards from the cabin, near the treeline. I made one last trip outside to lock up and turned to walk toward the truck when I froze. There was something standing near the trees. Not close, but close enough for me to make out its shape. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing nothing but what looked like dirty jeans. Noschert. His skin looked grayish, like it hadn't seen sunlight in months. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, half hidden behind a tree, staring in my direction. I could feel that stare even from that distance. I didn't run. I just walked slowly to the truck, trying not to show panic. I kept my eyes on him the whole time. When I opened the truck door, he took one step forward, slow, deliberate. That was all it took for me to slam the door shut, start the engine, and press the gas. The tires spun on the dirt before catching, and I drove out of there faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back once. When I reached the main road, I finally stopped and caught my breath. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I stayed at a small roadside motel that night, still too afraid to drive all the way home in the dark. The next morning, I called the cabin's owner to tell her I'd left early and that someone had been hanging around the property. She sounded calm, almost too calm, and told me she'd send her brother to check it out. A week later, she sent me an email saying her brother found nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. She said maybe it was just an animal or my imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Months later, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. The bare feet, the pale skin, the way he moved. I tried to look up missing people reports in that area, old news stories, anything. I found nothing. Sometimes I wonder if he lived out there, deep in those woods, surviving off whatever he could find. Maybe he watched that cabin often, waiting for people to come and go. Every time I think about it, I remember the feeling I had when I saw him, the cold realization that he wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He was waiting. And the night he circled the cabin, he wasn't trying to get in. He was studying me, learning how I moved, when I slept, when I turned off the lights. Now, even years later, when I drive through forested areas or stay somewhere isolated, I can't help but check the windows more than once. I still wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside. That cabin's still listed online. Same pictures, same description. Peaceful retreat in the woods, it says. But every time I see it, I can't help but imagine someone else staying there now, unaware, sleeping through the sound of soft footsteps outside, while something pale and barefoot moves just beyond the glass. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to drive out to a small cabin in northern Montana that I had recently bought at an auction. I was 34 at the time, working construction jobs in different towns, and I wanted somewhere quiet, a place I could fix up on weekends. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 10 miles off the main road, past a thin dirt path that cut through thick pine and uneven ground. When I first saw it, it looked like something left behind decades ago. Faded wood, roof half sagging, windows sealed with grime. But it was cheap and it was mine. That Friday afternoon, I packed a few tools, a sleeping bag, canned food, and drove out in my old Ford truck. The air got colder as I climbed up through the forest roads. The sun was already dropping behind the mountains when I reached the property, and by the time I parked near the cabin, everything around me looked dim and quiet. I stepped out and heard only the sound of the wind slipping through trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to press inward. The walls were dark with rot in some places. The porch boards bowed and soft. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. It groaned like something old waking up. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dampness. Dust hung in the air. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was one main room with a small kitchen space, a wood stove, and a single bedroom in the back. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling corners. I remember setting down my bag, sweeping the floor, and cleaning up a bit. I found a few old newspapers scattered in a corner. One dated back to 1997. Another from 2001. I wondered who lived here before, why they left it like this. There were old scratches on the inside of the door, long and uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp across it years ago. I thought it was probably from some animal that got inside once. When darkness came, I lit a small lantern. The light made everything look even older. The wind outside picked up and rattled the trees. I ate a can of beans straight from the tin, sitting on an overturned crate that I used as a table. Every few minutes, I'd hear something faint outside, branches snapping, leaves brushing against the walls, but it didn't sound unusual for a place so deep in the woods. I tried to sleep on the floor, wrapped in my sleeping bag. The wood stove was too rusted to use, so I relied on the small camping heater I brought. Around midnight, I woke up because I thought I heard footsteps outside. They weren't steady, just one or two crunches, then silence. I told myself it could have been an animal. I listened for a while, then drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the air was freezing, and my breath hung white in front of me. I stepped outside to look around. The ground was wet from light rain, and I noticed fresh tracks near the back of the cabin. Boot prints. They weren't mine. They came from the tree line and stopped right at the wall behind the cabin, then turned back toward the woods. I stood there for a while, staring at them. They looked recent. I didn't hear anyone during the night, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Still, I tried not to overthink it. Maybe a hunter passed through. I spent most of the day fixing parts of the cabin, nailing loose boards, cleaning the windows, clearing the path. Around noon, a light drizzle started, and the sky stayed gray. The whole forest looked darker. When I went out to gather some firewood from behind the cabin, I noticed something else. An old rusted axe leaning against the wall. I hadn't seen it the day before. The handle was rough and splintered, but it looked like it had been placed there recently, not left to rot like the rest of the tools I'd found inside. That made me uneasy. By late afternoon, I decided I'd sleep one more night and leave the next morning. The rain came down harder. I stayed inside, reading a few pages from an old magazine I'd found, listening to the wind and rain beat against the roof. It was a long, quiet night until something hit the side of the cabin around 2 a.m. A single heavy thump that shook the wall. I sat up instantly, my chest tight. I turned off the lantern and listened. Nothing for a while, then another sound. A dragging noise, slow and rough, moving along the outer wall toward the front door. I didn't move. I could hear the faint squeak of the porch boards bending, then silence again. The air felt heavy, the kind that makes every sound sharper. I stayed completely still until I finally heard the soft rhythm of rain again. I must have stayed awake for hours after that before falling asleep from exhaustion. When I stepped outside the next morning, the air was still and cold. I checked the porch and found muddy streaks on the boards, like someone had dragged a wet piece of fabric or maybe something heavier. I looked toward the woods, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement far off. A person, maybe, or just a shadow between trees. I packed my things faster than I ever had before. But before leaving, I decided to check something that had been bothering me. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped slightly downward toward a patch of bare dirt. The soil there looked recently disturbed, darker and softer than the rest. It was odd because I hadn't seen that patch before, and the rain hadn't been enough to make it look freshly dug. I crouched down and poked the dirt with a stick. It sank easily. Something about that spot didn't feel right. I went back to my truck, grabbed a small shovel from the back, and returned to it. I started digging, just curious at first, but the deeper I went, the stronger the smell became. A sour, rotting smell. After about 2 feet, the shovel hit something soft. I froze. I brushed away the dirt with my hands, and a piece of fabric appeared, gray and torn. Then, just under it, I saw what looked like part of a jacket sleeve, attached to something pale underneath. I stopped digging then. I didn't need to see more. My stomach turned cold. I knew exactly what it was. I stood there for a long time, staring at the hole, my hands shaking. The air was still, the woods silent. The cabin looked different now, like it had been watching the whole time. Whoever had left that body there hadn't gone far, maybe came back last night, maybe still somewhere out there. I dropped the shovel, grabbed my bag, and got into my truck. The tires spun in the mud for a second before catching. As I drove down that narrow dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the thin line of the road fading behind me. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over at a gas station about 20 miles away and called the local sheriff's office. I told them what I'd found, gave them the coordinates, and waited. A few hours later, a deputy came by, asked me to show the exact spot. They taped off the area, brought in more people. They found the body, a man, probably in his late 40s, buried shallow behind the cabin. From what they said later, it had been there less than a week. Whoever did it must have used the cabin as cover. The sheriff told me not to go back there for a while. I never did. I sold the place 2 months later, barely got half of what I paid. Even now, I still think about those footprints, the sound on the porch, the axe that wasn't mine. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I know what I heard that night. Someone had been there. Someone who buried a man behind that cabin and maybe watched me from the woods while I slept just a few feet away. And sometimes, when I close my eyes and think of that place, I can still hear that soft dragging sound moving along the wall, slow and patient, like it was waiting for me to wake up. It was early November of 2003 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Montana. I was 34 then, working long hours at a warehouse job in Spokane, and my mind had been running on fumes for months. I thought some time alone, far from everything and everyone, would clear my head. The cabin had been unused for nearly a decade, sitting deep in the woods near a narrow, half-forgotten dirt road. My uncle had passed away a few years back, and since no one in the family had reason to visit, it just sat there. Quiet, hidden, and untouched. The road leading up to it was rough, just two thin tire tracks pressed into the dirt and gravel, winding through thick pine woods that blocked out most of the daylight. I drove an old green Ford pickup that rattled every time the tires hit a rut. The air got colder as I climbed higher, and by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already starting to dip behind the tree line. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Dark brown would faded to gray, a tin roof speckled with rust, and windows so dirty they looked almost painted over. A dead birch tree leaned dangerously close to the left side, and a couple of boards on the porch were rotting. The place smelled like old wood and damp dust the moment I stepped inside. I left my bag near the door and opened the shutters, letting in what little daylight was left. The inside was simple: one main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the corner, a single cot, and a narrow door that led to a cramped bathroom. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, like the whole cabin had been waiting silently for years. I swept the floor with a broken broom I found near the stove, lit a few candles I'd brought, and unpacked enough to make it feel like I wasn't just visiting a ghost of someone else's life. That first night, I sat by the stove, listening to the fire crackle and the wind slide through the trees outside. It was quiet, so quiet that even the smallest sound felt sharp. I could hear the creaking of the cabin as the cold settled in, and once in a while, I thought I heard something moving out in the woods. But I told myself it was probably deer or the wind pushing through the dry branches. I slept with my jacket still on, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled faintly like mildew. The next morning was cold enough to see my breath indoors. The air had that sharp bite that only comes from being so far away from everything. I made coffee on the small propane stove and stepped outside. The clearing around the cabin was surrounded by tall pines and heavy brush, and a small path ran down behind the hill toward a shallow creek. Everything was still, not a sound except for the faint trickle of water and the occasional caw of a crow somewhere far off. I spent most of the morning clearing the porch and chopping a bit of wood for the stove. Felt good to do something physical. By late afternoon, clouds started rolling in, heavy and gray. I could smell the snow in the air before it even began. When it started, it came fast. A slow drizzle that turned to thick flakes, falling so heavily that by evening the ground was already covered in white. I sat near the stove again that night, reading an old magazine I found in one of the drawers, the kind with curled edges and pages that smelled like damp paper. Every so often I heard faint cracks from outside, branches breaking under the weight of the snow. But then, just before midnight, I heard something else. A single thud from behind the cabin, not like a branch falling. It was heavier, slower, like something or someone stepping down hard on the frozen ground. I froze where I sat, staring at the wall. Then another sound, closer this time, near the window. The snow outside made everything glow faintly, so through the frost-covered glass I could see faint movement. A shadow, tall, passing by. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe an elk wandering close. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I sat there without moving, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. After a few minutes, the sound faded away, swallowed by the wind. I waited another hour before finally crawling into bed, though I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified in the dark. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The world looked clean and silent, the air still and sharp. I stepped outside to check around the cabin, and my stomach tightened when I saw them. Footprints. Not paw prints, not animal tracks. Actual footprints. They started near the back wall of the cabin, where I'd heard the thuds, and circled halfway around before vanishing into the woods. They were deep, clear, and spaced far apart. Boots, by the look of them. I followed them a few feet into the trees, but they disappeared quickly where the snow had blown over. The realization hit hard. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night, walking right up to the cabin. I checked the door. It was still locked. Windows were shut tight. Nothing seemed moved inside. Still, something about it left me unsettled in a way I couldn't shake off. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, chopping wood, cleaning, doing anything to keep my hands busy. But every time I looked at the tree line, I imagined someone standing there, just watching. As evening came, I stacked the fire high and made sure everything was locked up again. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something again, this time softer, like a slow dragging sound along the porch boards. I didn't move. The sound went on for what felt like minutes, then stopped. Then, a dull knock, barely a tap, on the wooden wall. My throat went dry. I stayed frozen until the light started to creep through the window. When I finally opened the door in the morning, there was something in the snow near the steps. A small scrap of fabric, blue denim, caught on a splintered board. It looked like it had torn from a jacket. The tracks were there again, clearer this time, leading back into the woods. I followed them farther, through the trees, past the creek, until I found where they stopped abruptly at a line of thick brush. I pushed through, and what I saw made my skin crawl. About 30 yards from the cabin, buried halfway under a layer of snow and leaves, was an old campsite. Collapsed tent, torn and dirty. A few empty cans, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. Everything looked like it had been there for years. But the strangest thing was the smell. A faint, sour odor that I recognized immediately. It was the smell of something that had once been alive. I crouched closer, brushing aside some of the snow, and that's when I saw it. A boot, sticking up from the dirt near the edge of the tent. Then the curve of a pale, stiff hand, half buried beneath. My whole body went cold. I didn't need to dig any further to understand what it was. I stumbled back, my legs weak. The realization hit all at once. Someone had died out here, maybe years ago. Maybe that person never left these woods at all. And if those tracks from the night before weren't from him, then someone else had been close to that same spot, close to me. I packed my things that afternoon, quick and clumsy. I didn't bother cleaning up. I just needed to leave. The snow had started again, soft flakes drifting down as I loaded my truck. When I looked back one last time at the cabin, it looked smaller than ever, almost swallowed by the trees. I drove until the road widened back into gravel, and I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I reported what I found to the sheriff's office in the next town over. A few days later, they called to confirm it. A man had been found buried near the old campsite. Based on his belongings, he'd likely gone missing more than 10 years earlier. They never found out who had been walking around the cabin that night. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone passing through. But I've thought about those tracks 100 times since. They were fresh, and they didn't match the size of the boot found in the ground. I never went back to that cabin again. Sometimes, though, when I close my eyes, I can still see those prints in the snow, clean, deep, and leading straight toward where I slept. It was late October 2016 when I took a short job in a small village outside Carlisle, up in the northern part of England. I was 31 at the time and working as a freelance groundskeeper, taking any seasonal work I could get. A local man had called me after hearing from someone in town that I could handle old properties and rough land. He said he needed someone to look after a small cabin beside an old graveyard, to clear out the brush and fix the fencing before the winter rains came. It sounded simple enough. Quiet, isolated, and paying better than I expected. I accepted without thinking much about it. When I arrived a few days later, the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a wide field, behind a row of leaning trees that separated it from the main road. The graveyard was right beside it, small, surrounded by a crumbling stone wall, maybe 50 or 60 graves total. Most of the headstones were half sunk into the earth, worn flat by rain and moss. The air smelled of damp soil and dead leaves. It wasn't eerie in a storybook sense, just quiet, forgotten, heavy with the kind of silence that hangs in places where time barely moves. The man who hired me, Mr. Dalton, wasn't there when I arrived. He'd left the key in a tin box nailed to the cabin's doorframe. I let myself in. The cabin was one room with a small loft above. The air inside was cold and smelled like rot and dust. There was an old metal bed frame against one wall, a table with a cracked surface, and a fireplace full of bird nests. The floor creaked under my boots with every step. I decided I'd stay only during the day and drive back to my rented room in town each evening. That first day, I cleared weeds and brambles that had grown over the graveyard wall. The grass was knee-high in places, tangled and wet. My hands grew sore from cutting through it. Every now and then, I'd notice things half buried in the ground. Old tin cans, bits of broken glass, a child's shoe. I guess people must have used the area as a dumping ground over the years. It took me nearly 5 hours to reach the far corner of the yard where the ground dipped down toward a row of trees. The soil there was soft and uneven. It felt different under my boots, like it had been turned recently. I thought maybe animals had been digging. When I got back to the cabin that evening to pack up, I noticed the back door was cracked open, just slightly. I was certain I'd closed it when I arrived, but I brushed it off, thinking the wind must have pushed it loose. The latch was weak and half rusted. Still, it made me uneasy. I checked the corners of the cabin, expecting maybe a stray animal, but nothing seemed out of place. The next day, I brought my tools and stayed longer. I started repairing the fence around the graveyard. The ground was hard and the old posts snapped easily, so I replaced a few with new ones I'd brought in the truck. As I worked, I kept noticing a faint smell, something sour and earthy, drifting from the far side near the tree line. Came and went with the breeze. By midday, it was stronger, enough to make me stop working. I followed it without really meaning to, walking toward that soft patch of soil I'd seen before. There, behind one of the larger trees, I found a narrow trench, freshly dug, maybe 2 or 3 feet deep. It wasn't new enough to be damp, but the edges were clean and the soil loose. I could see bits of cloth mixed in, like someone had buried old rags. I didn't like the sight of it. It wasn't my business, and I figured it could have been an animal burrow that someone had filled back in. Still, I remember standing there for a long time, looking at it, feeling an odd sense of being watched. Not by anyone or anything specific, just that feeling when your mind gets too aware of itself. The woods were silent. Not even the crows were calling. I went back to the cabin, finished up, and locked everything carefully before I left. When I came back the next morning, something was wrong again. The door was open, both the front and back this time. My tools were still where I left them, but the shovel I'd been using was gone. I searched around, thinking I might have misplaced it, but I found it leaning against one of the headstones, the blade freshly covered in dirt. Someone had definitely been there overnight. That night, I told myself I'd stay late, just to see if anyone was messing around. I parked my truck behind the cabin, turned off the lights, and waited inside. The air got colder as the sun went down. The only sounds were wind brushing through the dry grass and the occasional snap of wood from the old fireplace. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside, slow, steady, moving along the graveyard wall. They weren't heavy, but distinct enough to know it wasn't an animal. I stayed still, gripping the small torch in my hand, listening. The steps stopped near the window. I didn't move for a long time. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe just wind shifting through the cracks of the wall. After a few minutes, The steps moved away toward the back of the cabin. I waited another half hour before I went outside. My torchlight cut through the fog that had started rolling in from the field. There were footprints in the mud, bare, small ones, like a woman's. They led toward the same area behind the trees. I followed them until I reached that patch of disturbed soil again. The ground had been dug up deeper now, almost waist-high. The smell was worse, strong and rotten. I wanted to believe it was an animal carcass, maybe a fox or something buried and dragged out. But as I stood there, I saw what looked like the corner of a tarp sticking up through the dirt. My gut went tight. I didn't want to touch it, but something in me felt like I had to see what was there. I pulled the tarp slightly with a stick. Underneath was a bundle of dark fabric, like a coat, wrapped around what looked like hair. That was enough for me. I dropped the stick, turned back to the cabin, and locked myself inside. I sat there until morning, barely breathing, waiting for daylight to come through the cracks in the walls. When it did, I packed up everything and drove straight to town. I went to the police station and told them what I'd found. They took me seriously, thankfully, and drove out there with me that afternoon. When we reached the spot, the graveyard looked the same, except the dug-up patch was wider. They started digging carefully. What they found was a shallow grave. Inside was a woman's body, wrapped in a dark coat, her face barely recognizable. She'd been dead for months. They told me later she was from a nearby village, missing since early summer. The investigation went on for weeks. It turned out Mr. Dalton, the man who hired me, had vanished. The name wasn't even his real one. The police traced the phone he used to a temporary number bought in cash. The cabin had no legal owner anymore. It belonged to an estate that had been tied up in probate for years. Whoever that man was, he'd used the property as cover. After giving my statement, I didn't go back. I moved south for another job and tried not to think about it, but I never forgot that place. I can still see it. The crooked fence, the sunken graves, the soft ground near the trees. I think about how close I was to digging that spot myself, how I might have been the one to uncover her before anyone else. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I remember that sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and steady in the dark, and how whoever it was must have been watching me from the graveyard while I worked, waiting for the right time to come back. It's been years now, but the memory stays sharp. Not because of what I saw, but because of how ordinary it all was. No ghost stories, no strange lights, just a quiet bit of land, a man with the wrong name, and a body buried in plain sight beside forgotten graves. I never took another job in a place that remote again. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hides things, the kind that lets people do whatever they want without anyone hearing. And I still wonder sometimes, when I pass old cemeteries or empty cabins on the side of the road, how many others hold something like that, buried just deep enough that nobody looks. It was October of 2018 when I took a short break from work and decided to spend a few days alone in a small wooden cabin near the edge of a forest in Northumberland, England. I had rented it online after seeing some photos of the quiet landscape. Rolling hills, fog-covered trees, and long, empty trails leading into thick woods. I had been working too many hours at the time and felt like I needed to breathe air that didn't come from air conditioning. The cabin looked like the perfect place to reset my mind. It was small, just one floor with 2 rooms. A bedroom with a small bed and a kitchen area attached to a sitting space with a wood stove. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and no television. It was the kind of silence that almost felt heavy at first. When I arrived, it was already late afternoon. The air was damp, and a light drizzle had been falling since I left Newcastle that morning. The gravel path leading to the cabin was full of puddles, and when I parked my rental car near the gate, I could hear nothing but the rain tapping against the metal roof. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall birch trees. their white trunks peeling in places, looking like bones sticking out of the earth. The view stretched into a dark forest behind the property, and there was a narrow dirt track leading deeper into it. Inside, everything was old but clean. The floorboards were uneven, the furniture looked handmade, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and something like kerosene. I unpacked slowly, opened the small window above the sink, and looked outside. The fog had thickened, and the light was fading quickly. I could barely see the line of trees now, just shadows blending into the gray sky. That night, I built a fire in the stove, made tea, and sat in an old armchair near the window. The sound of rain grew heavier. I watched it run down the glass in crooked lines, blurring the world outside into shapeless forms. Everything felt peaceful until I noticed something odd around 10:30. Through the fog and the rain, near the tree line, there was movement, just a small flicker at first, like someone walking past. I leaned forward, staring. For a few seconds, I thought I imagined it, but then I saw it again, a faint shape, dark against the pale birches. At first, I told myself it was a deer or maybe a person hiking back to one of the other cabins I had seen miles earlier along the main road. But the longer I looked, the more it felt wrong. The figure wasn't moving like an animal, and it didn't seem to have a flashlight. It just stood there. The rain distorted my view, but I could tell it was someone. It looked like a woman. I could make out a long coat that hung stiffly, and her posture seemed oddly straight, as if she wasn't moving at all. After a few minutes, I forced myself to turn away and focus on the fire. I told myself I was tired and seeing things. When I looked again a moment later, the shape was gone. The next morning, I woke up early. The forest was completely quiet except for a few distant bird calls. The rain had stopped, and there was a thick layer of mist sitting low across the clearing. The air was cold enough to see my breath. When I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I noticed footprints near the edge of the clearing, faint but visible in the soft mud. They were small and they led out from the trees toward the cabin, then back again. I crouched down to look closer. They didn't belong to boots or hiking shoes. They looked like worn-out flat shoes. The prints stopped only a few meters from the cabin steps. I remember feeling my stomach tighten. Could have been anyone, maybe a local walking through, but the place was remote. Far too remote for someone to just wander by during the night. I went back inside, locked the door, and made coffee. For the rest of the day, I tried to keep myself busy. I read an old book I'd brought, took a short walk down the path during daylight, and gathered some firewood. The woods were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful anymore. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. That evening, the wind picked up. The trees outside began to sway, and every so often, I'd hear something snap in the distance. Around dusk, I saw something again. From the window, beyond the open field, she was standing there. The same dark figure. This time I could see her more clearly. Tall, thin, with long dark hair that stuck to her face. Her clothes looked soaked. She didn't move at all, just stood there, facing the cabin. The air felt colder suddenly, and the back of my neck started to tighten. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the fog, but she didn't vanish. I stayed inside, sitting perfectly still for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the light faded, and I couldn't see her anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me flinch, the wind scraping branches against the cabin, the occasional creak of the walls. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I started packing my things as soon as there was daylight. When I stepped outside to load the car, I noticed something on the side of the cabin wall. Near the window where I'd been sitting, there were handprints, muddy, smeared across the wood. They were too high up to be accidental, and the shape was small, like a woman's hands pressed flat against the wall. The prints were fresh, still damp. I drove out of there as quickly as I could. The road back to the main highway felt endless. Even after I got to the nearest village and stopped for fuel, my hands were still shaking. I told myself not to think about it anymore, that maybe someone was camping nearby or maybe it was just a coincidence. A few days after I returned home, I decided to look up the area out of curiosity. The cabin's listing had been taken down, but I found a few local news stories. One article from 2015 mentioned a missing woman from a nearby village. She had gone missing after being seen walking toward that same forest. They never found her. Locals had stopped camping in that area after a few hikers claimed to see a soaked-looking woman wandering near the tree line late at night. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, and I still don't, but something about it didn't sit right. I kept remembering how the footprints looked, small, neat, almost careful, and how those muddy handprints were pressed just under the window where I had sat watching the rain. Months passed, and I tried to forget about it. But even now, whenever it rains at night and I see the drops streaking down my window, I sometimes think about that cabin in Northumberland, the smell of damp wood, the cold air, the fog, and I remember her standing there perfectly still, watching. What made it worse was what I discovered later. About a month after the trip, I got an email from the rental company. They apologized for the delay in returning my deposit and mentioned that the cabin I'd stayed in was now unavailable indefinitely. Out of curiosity, I replied, asking why. They didn't go into detail, just said the property had been found vandalized and that there had been an incident involving local authorities. I didn't ask more, but I couldn't stop imagining those muddy handprints. Someone had been there while I was inside, sitting in that chair by the window watching the rain. Someone close enough to reach up and press her palms against the wall. I haven't been back to the countryside since. I still take breaks from work, but I never stay anywhere that remote anymore. I stay in places with neighbors nearby with lights and phone signal. I don't trust the quiet anymore because I learned that silence doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it's just what fills the space before you realize you're not as alone as you thought.